As we continue to monitor CDK Global's restoration process, it's becoming increasingly evident that this will be something dealerships will work through for months to come. It will certainly affect bottom lines, and it did in the month of June. Here now is Kevin Tynan, Senior Automotive Analyst, with his perspective on the implications for the industry from CDK Global's blackout there, or shutdown, I guess we could call it. But very unfortunate situation, Kevin, that's happened to CDK, but it has definitely got this rippling effect in retail automotive with so many automotive groups out there. Now the numbers are starting to come in, and it looks like it really has had a negative impact on many auto groups around the country. So maybe start from that perspective.
And I've spoken to dealers, OEMs, and I think there wasn't, to me, and the dealers that I spoke to, there wasn't a huge disruption in sales or repair orders. I felt like there was a lot of, hey, we're doing that the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
But then we have to go backfill the systems down the
Yeah,
road,
that's
right? Now this all does have to become computerized again, and all this data has to make it back into our management systems, our management softwares, and that's going to. So I think the burden on the dealers is still to come, and it'd probably be a little bit more behind the scenes than this headline. Here's how many units were lost. It might just be a shift from the second quarter to the third quarter till these things actually get into the management softwares. But it is a mess.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure that it completely stopped sales in a lot of cases. Certainly a disruption, and certainly a problem that we haven't seen the end of yet. But there were still deals getting done. And from the OE's perspective, one of the things we saw was, it's difficult for dealers going through their finance companies or with their finance partners to have write a lease payment, right? Because you're doing things on paper and you're not 100% confident, that every number reconciles and everything works the way it's supposed to work. So, there's nuanced parts of the business that were probably more impacted than this big, X number of lost sales here. It was a delay in a lease deal because you really weren't sure. And as you go up in the price range, if you look at somebody like Rolls-Royce, you could be talking, big difference in a monthly payment because you're calculating things the old-fashioned way as opposed to putting them through the system. So the worst is probably yet to come, and I think a lot of that will be behind the scenes at this point.
Sure. It looks like Automotive News is reporting that GM, Honda, and Mazda had gains. However, Hyundai and Kia were off, and Nissan had a drop as well. And they're really pointing the finger to the CDK situation. So obviously these automotive companies are going to be off. However, the article goes on to say that these deals will probably be made up and these profits in the month of July.
Yeah, and look, I think when you look at it, Jim, where we're at in inventory, 3 million units, which is not peak, which would be about 4 million, but it's certainly not a dearth of supply on the ground.
Yeah.
So I think, to some extent, this is a little bit of a pause for some of those manufacturers that are overstocked and continue to be overstocked. Sort of the way there was a chip shortage and there was the pandemic, and so it's this sort of natural catastrophe or unnatural catastrophe that lets you get off the sort of selling accelerator for at least a period. But what I would say is, and this is the case in every quarter, just looking at the volume gain or decrease isn't the story. So you can have the Hyundai, Kia, or the brands who sell fewer units might just be firmer on price because they're not overstocked. And that would be reflected in their quarterly earnings and their margins, where you can have an automaker, on the other hand, who reports a nice jump, but it's really not great volume, right? That we're oversupplied, we're discounting, we're incentivizing, there's lease deals, there's low rate financing. So we can show a volume gain because we got to clear the deck for our retailers.
Yeah.
So we can continue to produce more and push those vehicles out. But where that would be reflected, you get to report a sales gain today, but your earnings report in a couple of weeks is where that will show up as a negative, more so than just somebody who is undersupplied is saying like, well, we don't have the product anyway. We're not going to be discounting. So your sales suffer, but your margins and your profitability is still strong.
Right. So where do you think we're going to be ending up for the first half of 2024? Overall, in good shape?
A reasonable number. Like, honestly, I would rather see a, sub 16 million unit market with reasonable inventory, reasonably strong pricing, as opposed to see something that, we're getting seasonally adjusted numbers in the 17s, and it just means their inventory would be frothy,
right?
Margins and pricing
incentives
would have no power
all over the place.
All over the place. It would be a disaster. So while I don't have a huge amount of hope that manufacturers are going to be rational on output to the point where we start to see inventory decline, maybe it doesn't accelerate as fast as it had been, but I think there's some reasonable consideration for your margins happening now that we hadn't really seen in the past. So I'm hopeful, and I would rather, like I said, see a mid 15 to low to high 15 million unit market with good pricing and good margin power.
Yeah, for sure. And with regard to, we talked about this previously and on other shows, but are we seeing leasing back to where it was at that 30% number that the industry has enjoyed for so long?
30. We're in the low to mid 20s again, and that is really a reflection of supply.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, call it what you want. Leasing is an incentive, a form of incentive. When there's too much product,
that's right,
you'll see automakers get aggressive on leasing because it creates affordability for the consumer, just like cash on the hood would, or just like 0% financing would. So it's a way to move product. So it's not, and you know what? There's a lot of things, Jim, in the industry that are like that. They're not quite what they were at the peak. They're not what they were when they were at their best, and they're somewhere in between. Leasing is one of those things. When there was too much supply, it's a 30% market. When there's no supply, it's a 17% market, and now we're in the mid-20s. So we're, everything has sort of come back, but it's not all the way back to where it was. And look, there's a place for it, right?
Yeah.
Just like with incentives or discounting.
Sure.
But
you would think though that with manufacturers and the the high price of a new car, and everybody's trying to get their hands around this affordability issue, that a good strong lease program for an OEM would move a lot of merchandise and put new cars in driveways.
Yeah, it does. But what it also does, it puts pressure on your finance company 3 years down the road, right? Because you're writing residuals today. Yeah. With a spike in inventory and a weak pricing environment, now you're taking write-offs. Yeah, it's kicking the can down the road 36 months, but someday those vehicles come back to roost, and
they do.
You're writing down the value of your lease portfolio. So it's a little bit of a pay me now, pay me later kind of thing.
Right.
Most times in history, it's I'll pay you later. But there's those sort of behind the scenes dynamic that work with leasing and incentives in general, right? You're ruining the residual value of your vehicles, and someday you're going to pay for that.
Sure. Have you seen any tightening of any credit out there? I mean, we hear about delinquencies up, and the economy is, depending on who you talk to, in many cases is not what they would like it to be from a financial standpoint. Has there been any tightening of any credit for consumers?
I feel like the tightening is coming from the consumer, right? And as if you remember in the worst of times in 08, 09, it was, I remember Mike Jackson from AutoNation used to always joke, like, if Jesus himself walked into my showroom, I couldn't get him financed, right? And it's not that, right? Yeah. I think that the consumer is a little bit shell-shocked, and it's starting to wear off a little bit, but, we were such a low-rate environment
I know.
For so long that anything above, 3% was
crazy.
Crazy, and I remember my parents telling me it was 19% on their first house,
That's right.
Their first mortgage, and So I think the consumer was so conditioned, that money was so cheap and so easy for so long,
Yeah.
that there was a little bit of a pushback when rates adjusted. And I won't even say it got too high. It was just, it was rationalization of that's what the economy needed. And that's starting to get absorbed a little bit.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's from the financial company perspective. I think it's the consumer saying like, hey, I remember when I would pay 3% for that, and now I'm talking 8-9% for that.
Right, right, yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how the second half of the year goes, right? I mean, here we are in July.
I think again, that comes down to production discipline, which seems to be, rational and reasonable. And as long as manufacturers don't really run out too far ahead of their skis, I think we're okay. I think if this is a production planned 16 million unit market, and we come in, 100,000 units below or above that, I think we're okay. We just don't want to do too much too soon and really back up. Because the other thing too you have, Jim, is if the manufacturers are going to overproduce and push that product on the retailers have a couple of extra, bullet points here to say, hey, this isn't a 0% market, so my floor plan expense is costing me money now.
Right.
So I don't want too much product. Where back in the day, in a zero interest rate environment, it was very easy for the manufacturer to say, well, look, it's not costing you really anything to take 10 more units or 20 more units or whatever the number is. But now it is. So now the dealers kind of get together and say like, no, we're pushing back. We can't take this inventory because it is costing us real money to carry it on the lot.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. Kevin Tynan, Senior Automotive Analyst, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Very much appreciated. Love when you're on. You're among the most watched segments that we have. So thank you for all the content. Really appreciate it.
It is always my pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks.